Hi, I'm Meta Spencer, and today I'm going to have a conversation about human rights with a person who knows quite a lot about human rights. This is Alex Neve, who was the director, or I don't know what your title was. What were your...
Secretary General.
Secretary General. Oh, that's always a title that is much better than being a president of something or a chairman of the board or something. Being Secretary General is just... I've never been a Secretary General, and I'm looking forward to it if I can ever find an organization that will let me do that. Anyway, it's nice to meet you, Alex. And I didn't get to finish my sentence because I went astray with this rambling, and that is that he was the Secretary General of Amnesty International for Canada for a long time. And he stepped down a couple of years ago, and now he's been teaching at both the University of Ottawa and Dalhousie University. A good part of it by, online kinds of interactions. But so I get acquainted. The wonderful thing about my role is if there's somebody that I have wanted to meet for 30 years, and I've never had an opportunity. In normal life, you can't do anything like this, but with the job that I have now, which is not a job, it's my hobby, I can just call up and I say, Alex Neve, I don't know you and you don't know me, but I want to interview you on my show. And everybody is so nice. They usually accept it. So I can get to meet all kinds of people that I would not have met before. So Alex Neve is somebody whose name I've known for years and years. And this is my chance to get acquainted. Hi.
Well, hello, and I look forward to the getting to know each other as well. And you're quite right. One of the benefits, if that's the right word to use, of these COVID times is that we've all become much more accustomed to and willing to jump onto a Zoom call for exactly these kinds of conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So maybe you can tell us how Amnesty International occurred and how you got to be the Canadian version of it.
Well, Amnesty International goes back over 60 years now. It was established in 1961 in the United Kingdom, and it was the inspiration of a British barrister named Peter Benenson, who became aware of the cases of two Portuguese students. And 1961, let's remember, was a time of cruel military government in Portugal. And these two students had been arrested because they had simply stood up in a cantina in Lisbon and raised their glasses of wine in a toast to freedom. He was obviously outraged. He was, I think, particularly outraged that it was happening in a country, just literally around the corner from where he was sitting. And I think above all, and I remember hearing him talk about this in later years, he was both outraged that it received very minimal attention. I think he came across it buried deep within a newspaper, one or two paragraphs. But at the same time, firmly convinced that not just a handful, but that millions of people would share in his sense of outrage. And recognizing that, why was it not possible to somehow harness that sense of collective outrage and turn it into a force for good? Now, this may not seem overly radical in 2022, when we're constantly mobilizing and taking action and organizing petitions and letter writing campaigns for any number of causes, but less so in 1961. And certainly the notion that people would get active and be concerned about the plight of someone who had nothing to do with their daily life in a country that they may or may not even have ever heard of, and more than likely would never visit, and would do something to try to address the injustices that they were facing. I think a lot of people assumed that he was a lunatic for imagining that people were going to be concerned, and that equally, he was a lunatic for imagining that it would make a difference if you somehow were able to mobilize that kind of action. Well, he set out to try to do so, and he began by publishing an opinion piece in the Observer newspaper on behalf of what he called the world's forgotten prisoners. And he urged people to join in a one-year campaign. He didn't set out to found an organization that would go on to become the world's largest human rights movement and win a Nobel Peace Prize, etc. He just wanted to mount a one-year campaign of trying to mobilize people to write letters, polite but forceful letters on behalf of a range of wrongly imprisoned individuals. And the response was enormous, and quite quickly it was proven that far from being a lunatic, Peter Benson was visionary. He was visionary in imagining that people would want to do this, and he was also visionary in imagining that it would make an impact. Not always, clearly not always. Otherwise, 61 years later, we wouldn't need Amnesty International anymore. But that very often, despite all sorts of reasons to think the contrary, governments would respond to that kind of pressure. So that's where it all began in 1961. It began with a very specific focus on behalf of what came to be known as prisoners of conscience. But over the decades that followed, Amnesty's mandate, which later came to be called mission, really expanded to the point where now it's the entire range of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Okay, let's there. That gives me two handles. I want to ask, first of all, how effective it is, because of course that's the big question. I suppose people want to invest their time if they think it really is going to do something. And probably most people are not as eager if they think it's a waste of time. So let's talk about that. And then let's talk about the scope of what counts as a violation of human rights. Tell me how you know, and do you keep any kind of records of how effective a letter writing campaign is?
So over the decades, and of course we do have decades to point to now, this hasn't just been a few months, there's been a systematic cataloging of impact and all sorts of different ways of measuring it. In some ways, it's very difficult to measure because, let's say, a prisoner that Amnesty has been working on does get freed. Well, more likely than not, Amnesty International was not the only organization or individual taking action. There may have been journalists working on the case. There may have been lawyers doing something on the case in a courtroom. Governments may have been taking action. Other organizations may have been taking action. So I think the starting point is to recognize that it's not possible, and I think it would be dishonest of any organization, including Amnesty International, to be the one that claims the victory. I think what's important is to recognize, I think especially as time has gone on and more organizations and activists have become engaged on human rights issues, there's many players and it's a collective effort. That having been said, certainly, the range of ways in which cases, issues, campaigns that Amnesty is active on, alongside others, which have led to change, whether it's outright victory or at least some positive change, are considerable. And there's many cases where it's been quite clearly documented that once Amnesty, let's stick with prisoner cases for a moment, for instance, that once Amnesty started taking action, suddenly a prisoner's situation in the detention center started to change. Maybe they were finally allowed some lawyers' visits. Maybe they were no longer held incommunicado. Maybe the torture stopped. Maybe they were moved to a better part of the prison. Maybe they were allowed visits from the Red Cross. And then as the pressure continued, eventually they were freed. And prisoners themselves, and perhaps that's what matters more than anything, have frequently come out of prison, having been released, and shared that story, shared the perception, and even have had prison guards say to them, who are all these people who are suddenly concerned about you? Where are all these letters coming from? It was noticed and it was making an impact. That's prisoner cases. But of course, human rights work is not just about freeing wrongly detained prisoners. Human rights work, very importantly, is about big change. It's about systems change. It's about institutional reforms. It's about fighting for new treaties at the United Nations, etc. And there we just have a long, long list of victories. Now, they're not victories that happen overnight, but campaigns that Amnesty has been central to, perhaps campaigns that Amnesty initiated or was one of the leader, and where the intended objective was realized. So I think back to the 1980s, for instance, and Amnesty International was a central organization in pushing the UN to adopt a new convention dealing with torture, the UN Convention Against Torture. Torture still happens in our world, obviously, but because of those efforts in the 80s, we have a solid international legal framework binding on countries all over the world, which is regularly used by lawyers who go into UN settings or who go into domestic courts to fight to end torture in particular cases. More recently, we've had, similarly, Amnesty was one of the organizations with partners that played a key role in creating a new global level arms trade treaty, a treaty that finally establishes rules that make it very clear that it is illegal for a state to sell or transfer or gift weapons to another state if it's clear that those weapons are going to be used to commit grave human rights violations.
That is wonderful. I'm familiar with the arms trade treaty, but I didn't know that it was approached as a human rights issue. That's news to me and very welcome news. Yeah. Now, what I wonder is how often, we have this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a pretty good statement, and is certainly a very comprehensive one. But I wonder how many people still would do what this what's his face, the guy in Saudi Arabia did this a couple of days ago, when Biden had a visit with him, and Biden allegedly, or controversially, I'm not sure whether he really did or not, spoke up about the murder of Khashoggi. Yeah. And I think the response was, well, you have your culture and we have our culture, and don't go meddling around in other people's culture. We have our own way of doing things. And look, you're not getting very far with that kind of thing anyway, when you try it in countries like Afghanistan. And I just wonder how many people try that kind of stupid defense anymore.
So there are many excuses and obfuscations that are used by governments, by companies, by police officials all over the world as a way of shirking or ignoring or excusing their human rights violations. And certainly one way up at the top of the list is the one you're referring to, where a government will insist that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not really universal, that it's a reflection of Western values, that it's a colonial instrument, that it isn't truly global in the ways it seeks to advance a human rights agenda. I think what is very notable, and so yes, we hear it from Saudi Arabia, we hear it from China, we hear it from numerous governments around the world, large and powerful governments, and less so. I think what is often very telling is that the most strident and aggressive assertions of that notion are made not by the individuals on the ground whose human rights are at stake, but by the very governments that are abusing their rights. So it's a very convenient thing for the abuser to say, sorry, this doesn't apply to us because we have a different culture. But if you were to ask communities on the ground, let's stick with Saudi Arabia, for instance, if you were to check in with journalists and human rights activists and others, women on the ground throughout Saudi Arabia, and have an honest, open discussion, I think you'd start to discover a very different perspective emerges. So I think we have to be very dubious around a lot of this assertion of what's often referred to as cultural relativism when it comes to universal human rights, when it is the abusers who are the ones asserting it. That said, I think there absolutely is room, and actually a very important imperative within the world of human rights, for us to be more universal in how we truly understand the universality of human rights. So that may, for instance, come down to perhaps we have a human rights norm, torture, we just talked about that a moment ago, or the protection against torture, that is universal. But perhaps there needs to be space for different understandings about, what's the best way to go about enforcing that norm. Should it always be what we might traditionally think of in Canada as, you've got concerns about torture, you go to court, you launch a lawsuit, you sue the police. Maybe in other parts of the world, there's different ways to do that, and that's, I think, an area where over the last couple of decades, we're certainly seeing that expand a great deal. I think the other area is that there's a lot of things that kind of get downplayed or left out of the human rights equation because the dominant Western sort of neoliberal approach to thinking about human rights back from the 50s and 60s didn't really care as much about these parts of the human rights equation. So most notably, that tends to apply to rights that are called economic, social, and cultural rights. The right to healthcare, the right to education, the right to a decent place to live, etc., which in international human rights are absolutely equal to the right to be protected against torture and the right to freedom of expression, the rights that are often called civil and political rights. But within the human rights system, they're often downplayed. They're given secondary status. They're not enforced in the same way. We certainly see that from our own government here in Canada. So we embrace a notion of human rights being universal, but when push comes to shove, we're not there universally for all rights in the same way.
Well, let's talk about marginal things. Let me think of something. I'm thinking, for example, of cultural appropriation of other people's clothing, headdresses and clothing styles, and the names of football teams, for example, a baseball or football team called the Redskins or something, is now treated as unacceptable because it's appropriating somebody else's culture and is treated as very offensive. Can be treated by certain people as extremely offensive. Now, I don't think that's a violation of human rights, but there will be people who will try to say that it is, or this use of the word, where people now put in after their names, they put he, she, and for the pronouns that they want to have known. And if I don't do that, I'm sort of considered a marginal human rights abuser. So I guess I'm pointing to the fact that there are cultural norms or attempts to make cultural differentiation on things that I think are not universal, and in a way, I just wonder how you go about deciding whether something of that kind is really an offense or just somebody being too picky.
Well, I think it's situation specific. I I would both agree and disagree with your view that those two examples, the pronouns that are used and the appropriation, and I think in particular in an Indigenous context, the appropriation of names for sporting teams, and whether or not all aspects of that constitute human rights violations, or whether just in a broader sense they're concerns, maybe even human rights concerns, but maybe not necessarily violations. I think with respect to the pronoun situation, I don't think I've ever heard anyone assert that, for instance, if you prefer not to put your preferred pronouns on your email signature or when you introduce yourself, that's a human rights violation. I think more to the point, what has come up, and obviously and is sometimes quite a contentious discussion, is that if someone has made it very clear that they want to be known by a particular pronoun, and you or someone else refuses to do so, that I think we're getting more into concerns about human rights violations, because that's obviously not showing respect for someone's sexual identity or gender expression or gender orientation. So I think there's kind of a difference I would see. Whether or not you choose to put your preferred pronouns out there, that's your choice, and your reluctance or refusal to do so is not an abuse of anyone's.
Okay, Jordan Peterson, I think there's a famous case where I think he got in trouble with the University of Toronto as a professor of psychology because some people wanted to be known as, I don't know, wanted a certain pronoun or something, and he didn't bother, and said that he wasn't going to do it. So he got in deep trouble. Now, should he get in trouble for that?
I personally think he should. Now, whether or not he gets fired or what kind of sanctions someone should face for something like that, I think is situation specific. It would largely depend on how deliberate or not their intention was, and looking at it in a wider context of other ways in which they act around gender diverse individuals. I think when you're in a position of power, as he was, a teacher in a university classroom, there's particular responsibilities that go with that as well. Mm-hmm. To go to the appropriation of names, I think I think it's an interesting one. Obviously, I think there's widespread recognition now, including from the teams themselves, that at best we should recognize this as an anachronistic relic of the past. That there was this obsession almost with using Indigenous names and imagery and even sacred objects to name sporting teams within high schools, within professional leagues. I mean, when you think about it now, it's absurd that was considered the thing to do. So I think the most benign is that people would recognize that it's a relic of the past. But I think when you put it, and doing a human rights assessment, as I say, is so often context specific. When you put that into the context of the wider concerns, obviously, about the systemic racism and exclusion and discrimination that those very same groups were experiencing, then it does start to carry with it a human rights violation. I don't think if it stood on its own and was not part of that deeply rooted context of persecution and violence and discrimination, then I would agree that it almost is trivial. But when it's situated in that context of racism and discrimination, then I think it does give rise to human rights concerns. Now, I guess the challenge here is, I think when we think about a human rights violation, we kind of look for, who's the perpetrator, sort of who committed the human rights violation, and So with your Jordan Peterson example, we know it's about him. I think in some of these other situations, it's a bit more amorphous. Where did the decision, the impulse to give a team that name come from? Did it just was it something that emerged from within that school or that neighborhood? It's a little bit more systemic than individualized. And I think one of the interesting journeys we've been on in human rights over the last 10 years or so is becoming more and more attuned to systemic human rights violations and not only individualized human rights violations.
Let me point to a different instance, and that is female genital mutilation, which I have some anthropological professor friends who are female and who believe that that the women in the countries that practice that ritual, or I don't know what you'd call it, that they would never have started the objections to using it, and they feel that it's a Western imposition on their culture, that people are coming in and saying that it's a violation of human rights to cut the clitoris of the 10-year-old girl. My reaction is, no, this is really a human rights violation, even if the people who practice it would never even think of it as such. Tell me what you think on that case, because that's the opposite from having the thing arise in, the choice of the football team's indigenous name arise from the local people. It really could be called an imposition of Western values, but on people who would never have done so themselves. But I still believe in it. Tell me what you think of that.
I think we have to be very careful when, as has been the case, I guess, with some of your colleagues or associates, when these kind of broad assertions are made about, the women tell us, or the women are of the view, as if there's one, all-encompassing notion of women who either have experienced or are carrying out FGM on their own daughters, and they all think the same and they all have the same experience, because clearly that's not the case. And I think even before we get into assessing the degree to which there's Western influence in this debate, I think we have to be very, very live to the fact that at grassroots in any country, any society around the world where FGM is prevalent, there are a variety of approaches to it. There are a variety of understandings as to why it's used. How much of it is patriarchal, how much of it is tradition, how much of it is right or wrong, asserted as even health-based, and that within any of those countries and societies, there are both supporters and opponents, and long have been before it became a big Western debate. I think when we translate the Western piece into it, I think going back to my earlier comments about sort of universality and cultural relativism, I think there's widespread agreement globally within the human rights community that FGM is a human rights violation. However, I think there's also recognition that when it comes to the best ways to do something about that, that's where we have to allow some cultural relativism. So the notion that a whole bunch of police would swoop in and start arresting, 70-year-old grandmothers who carry out FGM on the little girls in their neighborhood and lock them up, and that will solve the problem, is wrong. And we hear that, I think, most importantly, from women and girls on the ground in those communities. They instead are saying, let us lead this effort, equip and empower us to take this on,
Mhm.
provide us with the resources and the protection we need in doing so. But this is our struggle, and to have a bunch of European and North American well-intentioned activists suddenly take it up with a vengeance, if anything, might even set it back, and not advance the struggle.
Okay, that's a reasonable answer. I approve. Let's see. I'm sort of surprised at myself for detouring us immediately into some of the less momentous questions. The names of football teams is not exactly the thing that people should spend their whole careers fretting over. But
although I think for Indigenous communities, it matters a lot.
Well, okay. I certainly agree that there are people who get offended, and you never know. But certainly, I think we need to think much more about the plight of people like the Uyghurs and the Rohingya and the people who are fleeing from persecution in all kinds of places. And my impression is that, or was until you said this, that that most of what Amnesty does or has always traditionally done is write letters on behalf of particular individual victims of human rights violations who are in prison or otherwise abused. But you set me right by talking about the major problems, and that you're working at the level of the UN trying to get treaties built and things of that kind. So tell me, if you will, about that kind of global scale operation. What sort of things has Amnesty done along those lines to try to take care of not just particular individual victims, but whole populations?
Well, I think clearly in human rights work, be it for Amnesty International or really for anyone involved in human rights advocacy, clearly we don't want to continue to be stuck in a world where we're on an ongoing basis, we're having to respond to the latest arrest, the latest execution, the latest killing, one case at a time. We obviously, what we really want to be doing is creating the world where it doesn't happen in the first place. And that's what takes you into bigger approaches, wider approaches, systemic approaches that think about an entire population, or think about systems, think about the economy, think about our geopolitics, think about who has power and who doesn't have power, and start to advance reforms that will address those problems. So with the Uyghurs and the Rohingya, that's a perfect example, where obviously two populations that have suffered immensely, and not just for the last few years where they very much have finally been in the global spotlight, but for both the Uyghurs and the Rohingya, this goes back decades. In both instances, many assert, and I am one of them, that we are talking about situations that amount to genocide. This is at the very top of the international human rights pyramid in terms of our level of concern. Well, we can't only be working on Rohingya and Uyghur concerns one person at a time. Number one, it would be an impossibility. But number two, it would be totally unfair and arbitrary. And number three, where's the better world for Rohingya and Uyghurs in that? So whether it be Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and numerous other organizations and activists, very serious research has been done to uncover what brought us to this point. Why are the Rohingya treated this way? How is it that the Uyghurs are, relentlessly persecuted by the Chinese government? What are the legal issues? What are the economic issues? What are the cultural issues? And start to identify that broader framework, and then develop a campaigning and advocacy agenda that does something about that. Now, that's tough work, because sometimes what you're doing is trying to go up against not just years or decades, but perhaps even centuries of prejudice and bigotry and discrimination. And some of the things that need to change, therefore, are deep. They're grounded mainly in shifting societal attitudes and that sort of thing. But part of it is perhaps a more direct human rights agenda as well. That there's a clear need in Myanmar, for instance. There's an overwhelming need for law reform because the laws of Myanmar don't recognize the Rohingya. They're not citizens. They were, but that was stripped of them decades ago. So there's a whole law reform agenda that needs to advance in Myanmar, which is about restoring and granting citizenship rights to the Rohingya people. That's not going to solve everything overnight, but if we don't, at a minimum, start to have that kind of legal change, then the individualized, horrific human rights violations and killings that Rohingya experience, we won't even begin to make headway in that regard. Similarly, with the Uyghurs, there's a lot of legal issues in China around laws that have over the decades been used to restrict religious practices, the Uyghurs being a Muslim people, restrictions even on the use of Uyghur language, etc. So we always need to keep, I think, both of these levels in mind. Clearly, we have to still be responsive to the plight of individuals. And I think a group like Amnesty International, but many others, that's one of the things that is most mobilizing, I think, for a lot of people, that it is an opportunity to do human rights work that's going to make a difference for one person right now. We can't walk away from that. But, and I think this is the big challenge for any human rights organization, is finding the balance here. That can't be all we do, or we will never get to that better world. So finding the space to ensure that the wider institutional change is happening as well is crucial.
Okay, I've been working on an article about a new world order. And my whole point of view is that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is part of a new world order that formed at the end of World War II, along with the UN and the Bretton Woods institutions and various other, the end of colonialism and so on. So we have been living under a sort of set of norms anyway, which are regularly violated. And I guess the problem is there is no real world government, or we do have what we call international law, but they're not really laws because they're not enforced. Or they're enforced only in a haphazard, casual, do it the way you feel like doing it kind of version. And I think we need a new world order with a greater sense of human rights as being real laws, and as a procedure for establishing laws and making them very discreet through the United Nations, maybe a parliamentary assembly, and then in some method for enforcing international law. I mean, for example, right now, the war going on in Ukraine occurs because one guy, Putin, maybe entirely on his own, decided that he would violate the human rights of the Ukrainians by attacking them. And the International Court of Justice said, stop right now, get out of there, don't do it. And of course, they made us, well, stay in bed because wouldn't do a thing. Of course, he ignored it because nobody has to obey international law anymore. There's nothing that will happen if he flouts it. So what I think is that we need a system of making very specific regulations that are globally legitimate, and that means institutions that can no doubt about it, be legitimate organizations. And then use a global legal system to enforce adherence to international law, which would include some version of the human rights legislation, or the Declaration of Human Rights, let's say. It might not cover, I don't know whether it cover female genital mutilation or the names of football teams, but it certainly would cover invading another country, and so on. So tell me, is there any hope of approaching things at that level? Not just what are we going to do for the Rohingya, or what are we going to do about the people in Syria or wherever, but what are we going to do about making sure that international laws are clear and that there are means of enforcing them?
Well, this has been the priority for the international human rights community for years. It's often referred to as the enforcement gap, and we spent decades writing the laws, and we have an enormous amount of international human rights law now. It began with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but there's countless covenants and conventions and treaties and resolutions and principles that have been adopted over those decades, such that we're probably pretty close to having some sort of human rights law for almost any issue you could possibly imagine. But where we fall not just short, but dramatically short, is having the institutions in place that will ensure those laws are implemented, respected, and enforced. And that's, of course, where governments push back all the time. The human rights community for decades has had this at the very, very top of our list. But you can well imagine that there's hardly been a country anywhere on the planet that's interested in creating an international system that's actually going to hold them to account to all these beautiful words that are easy to write down on paper if they mean nothing. But suddenly, if there's real consequences to them, start to get a little bit more significant. That said, we have started to make some gains. A little over 20 years ago, 1998, states with Canadian leadership gathered in Rome and agreed to create an international criminal court. The ICC exists now. It's just celebrated its 20th anniversary this year of actually its establishment. The International Criminal Court, for the first time ever, means we have a global level institution, a court, not just a UN talk shop, a court which holds trials of individuals who are accused of the world's worst human rights crimes: genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Now, the ICC faces immense challenges, and no one, including those of us who were enthusiastic supporters of creating the ICC, ever imagined it was going to be an easy slam dunk journey. It's going to take decades for the ICC to have the resources, to have the political backing, et cetera, that it needs. But bit by bit, it's getting there. And notably, it's very much back in vogue and in the spotlight right now because of the situation you referred to, the Ukraine situation, where the court has moved rapidly to start to initiate some investigations. And a lot of states are showing interest in that and are being supportive of that. Obviously, they have their own political reasons for being supportive of the court now, when, for instance, they're not at all supportive of the court's efforts to deal with the Israeli-Palestinian situation. But you take your steps forward where your steps forward arise. So I think there's some hope there. More broadly, there's long been an interest in possibly creating what's often referred to as a World Human Rights Court. And unlike the International Criminal Court, which is about charging individuals, The World Human Rights Court would be about going after governments as governments. We already have this at regional level. There's a European Court of Human Rights, which is binding on all the members of the Council of Europe. Also here in the Americas, there's an Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Notably, Canada has chosen to stand outside of that system, even though we're part of the Americas. We can come back to that if you want to.
Mm-hmm.
The European Court of Human Rights has actually been very successful. It's been around for decades, and there's a whole range of very serious human rights concerns going back to the 50s in Europe that court took on, issued binding judgments against governments, and those governments were bound to and did comply with the judgments. Might we one day be able to create something like that at world level? It's obviously a much harder task to bring together a global community to agree to a court like that than it is to bring together a smaller group of countries that are regionally connected with each other, have close trade ties, etc. Mm-hmm. But I think that's still in front of us. The last thing I would say around this is we also have to remember that a big part of making sure that international human rights are actually enforced can and should come down to our own domestic level courts. Now, that may seem a bit naive to imagine, sure, Alex, right. We should be relying on the courts of Syria, in Syria, to be upholding international human rights norms to protect the Syrian people. Well, that's an extreme case. But we should certainly be looking to the Canadian courts. Canada has international human rights obligations. We should make sure that we have the institutions, the laws, the mechanisms in place that will ensure that we ourselves are ensuring that our international obligations mean something within our own country. And Meta, we're not there at all. We have actually a dismal approach. Now, obviously, the situation in Canada is not Syria, but we have a dismal approach in Canada when it comes to ensuring that domestically we're doing what we should to enforce those important international human rights obligations. And if we're doing so dismally, then how can we possibly stand up on the world stage and be cajoling and urging other governments to do so as well? So I think the last thing to highlight there is one of the key things to remember when it comes to enforcing international human rights obligations around the world, it starts at home.
Well, I certainly would agree with you there. But the other thing that bothers me a little bit about this ICC is, so far as I know, they've never been able to get anybody while he's doing the violation. In other words, we don't have anything like a world police force that could go in and say, look, he's caught right in the act of doing this terrible atrocity. Let's send the cops and make him stop. Before but
really, that goes back to what I was saying. It's going to be a journey, and in fact, the ultimate goal of having a world police force, for instance, which is on the agenda for many activists, that's further down the road. And will we get there soon or not? Who knows? Will we find other ways of ensuring that even without a world police force, that we can at least rely upon the RCMP and other police around the world to be playing that role themselves? That's, I think, where a lot of our focus needs to go right now.
Okay, I think that, we're not going, in fact, I wouldn't even be in favor of having a world police force because I'm afraid of totalitarianism. I don't want any force that's big enough to actually overcome the military strength of anyone or any combination of countries. So that means that we got to figure another way out. But let's talk about the case of Putin right now, because that guy is a war criminal. I think there can't be any doubt about it. He's violated the instructions of the International Court of Justice to stop it, and he already was, in violation. That's what they were saying. Why don't we have a situation where we can have the ICJ and maybe the two other bodies like the General Assembly and maybe a world parliament, global parliament at the UN, authorize collectively, because I think you'd need to have legitimacy for sure, say, this guy is a criminal and he has to be stopped now. So anybody that wants to apply to us for authorization from Russia, because you guys brought him to power, he's your problem, but you've got to solve it. Any group of people that want to take responsibility for removing this man and replacing him, we will entertain your application, and we will just decide whether or not this is a legitimate case to be made for a coup, and then have a legal coup to get rid of the guy before he does all the damage that he's already done. I don't want to wait until he's already, killed 1 million people. I want to stop him right now. And there needs to be a way of doing it without sending military force in from outside. If I were Russian, I wouldn't even want outsiders or UN police force or whatever to come in and do it. I would want it to be our responsibility as Russians to take this guy out and put in a decent leader.
Well, I think you'd as enticing as your description may be, I think that's exactly the kind of scenario that governments resist, is giving over that kind of power to global institutions to be the ones who get to decide who should or should not be in power in any particular country. Because they look at that and think, okay, today it's going to be Vladimir Putin, tomorrow it's going to be me. And so I think you would find that it would be nigh impossible to generate the kind of global political support that would be needed, because you're talking about major reform of global institutions, new provisions in the UN Charter, etc.
Absolutely.
I think the other part that would be tricky in that is, at the end of the day, even with what you've just described, that there's a resolution that comes from, I think you described 3 world bodies calling for Vladimir Putin to be deposed. How do you implement that if Vladimir Putin is not willing to be deposed? And we're back to, I think, the scenario you were concerned about is, what we do want to avoid is a scenario where it just becomes full-out war and there has to be an invasion of Russia in order to depose Vladimir Putin. I think but one of the things I would pick up on that I think you referred to several times in your comments is this notion of generating change, generating something from within Russia. And I think that's what is so crucial here. And that's where, and these unfortunately don't offer us immediate solutions in the middle of a horrific crisis like Ukraine. But if the world starts to get serious, for instance, about ensuring that human rights organizations within countries actually receive meaningful, strong support to do their human rights work, if we ensure that we are more consistent and meaningful in imposing sanctions and other kinds of penalties on governments with serious human rights concerns at an early stage, not when the genocide is underway or the invasion of Ukraine has happened. If we start to show that leaders like Vladimir Putin will consistently, month after month, be called out and criticized and derided in major UN meetings, etc., which never happened with Vladimir Putin for years and years and years. If we can start to make that kind of shift, then hopefully we're strengthening from within the ability of the forces for rights and justice in that country. And that will be the downfall of people like Vladimir Putin before we reach the stage of invading Ukraine. Now, I know that offers us no comfort, or offers the people of Ukraine no comfort in this time of massive crisis. But if this crisis doesn't become our wake-up call to realize we've got to make that shift, we've got to make a shift to ensuring that with all the weaknesses and limitations of the international human rights system, we've talked about its lack of enforcement, etc. With all of those weaknesses, if we nonetheless don't, with conviction, consistency, and principles, play the game of human rights all the time, in all the ways that we can, then we're going to get nowhere. And we've got to be
yes, but the problem is what they call reality. Economics and all the other factors. I mean, right now we have this thing. Today's paper would be a good example of a flap going on about the export of turbines for the Nord Stream pipeline carrying gas to Europe from Russia, and of course that has been blocked because of sanctions. Some turbine material was in Canada for repair, and Canada wouldn't send it back because of the sanctions. But now they've decided to do so because the reality is that Germany is liable to get awfully cold this winter unless they have more gas. So the Germans have asked for, the German government anyway, has asked to have those turbines released, even though it's a violation of their principle, which is, you don't play ball with this guy. You do everything you can short of military attack to curb Putin's excesses. Just as there's another flap going on about Biden's trip to Saudi Arabia and his fist bumping with a murderer. Do you fist bump with a murderer? Well, yes, you do. If you got to have his oil and you want him to increase the amount of oil that is sent out, and you'll get both sides of the point of the position being proposed in every dialogue.
Well, all I'm saying is if we continue to live in that world where we're always coming up for an excuse, yes, but there's an economic interest, there's a strategic interest, then we don't get to complain when Vladimir Putin invades Ukraine, because we've set the stage. And if we don't, and it will be tough sometimes, I'm not pretending it'll be easy. It will mean tough decisions. It will mean sometimes that there will be sacrifice for an entire nation, hardship for an entire nation. But that's what it's going to take if we're really going to shift to a world where human rights mean something. We have to stop living in the world we've lived in since the Universal Declaration was agreed in 1948 of, human rights, however, not here, not now, not for them, not today, not until tomorrow, after we do this, before we do that, then we have no one to blame but ourselves.
Well, I absolutely 100% agree with you. And I'm glad to find a soulmate on this issue, because I think we really do have to put a different level of pressure on ourselves and on the world to say it's not enough to just temporize. We have to make some major changes pretty soon. So thank you so much for this. It's been absolutely wonderful. Appreciate it so much. And carry on.
All right. Thanks very much, Meta.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Project Save the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week, sometimes even more. And this is episode 478. You can watch or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. Eventually, we post the transcripts there too. When you get there, look around, because we have conversations going on there about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. After you've watched or listened, scroll down and share your thoughts about the show with the other viewers. This is the place for dialogue, so please join in. Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine. You can buy a single copy or subscribe for $20 Canadian per year through PressReader. Just go to pressreader.com on your browser, and in the search bar, enter the word peace. you'll see the cover of the current issue and buttons to click to subscribe.